Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of the Coral Gulain. And it's in not the best of states, so to speak. So, let's have us a talk about chapters 14 and 15 and the end of part 3, which is brutal. But before we start that, I have a question. The question is, when I look at like how I'm progressing right now, I'll be done with A Forge of Darkness on Thursday, which is cool. But the question is, what do I do then? Do I immediately start Fall of Light? Or should I don't know, put in some other like random stuff and then start immediately with like a chapter by chapter read through of The God Is Not Willing, which will come out for European people on the 1st of July. So I'm kind of divided because of like I don't you know I feel like starting it as early as possible. I mean, I want to read as fast as possible. But I also feel like it might be, not cool for people who can't get their hands on like a copy of the book yet. Although I guess you can technically just order like the European Bantam version of it and get it shipped to you. That should probably be possible, I guess. But I'm kind of, just let me know what you think. Should I do that, or should I wait with like The God Is Not Willing until a bit later? Yeah, I'm very much undecided on that matter. So if those of you who actually watch these videos will let me know what you think about it, that would be really cool, really helpful because, yeah, I'm not good at making decisions in general. But now, let's talk about Civil War, right? Cheers. All right, so like the first thing I noticed in like these last chapters in part 3 in general is how quickly things escalate in this like coming civil war that everyone is aware of that it's coming and so forth, and how quickly we go from like a travel quest or whatever you have with Earthan and Draconis and so forth, and you have those travels of Orthantal and which is still pretty harmless standard fare to that immense and incredible horror scene where we suddenly have, I mean, basically, and I kind of didn't talk too much about it yesterday, but the whole like end of chapter 13 with Envy and Malice and Spite is mostly like a study in horror movie or horror stories, like how to do that on like a terrible level. You have scary kids being evil, murdering people, and all of that. It just like it just was a incredibly well done like study in how to do horror, and that already I could have read that as a warning that things are going to escalate even more because we already got like that first part where uh, we see how the Legion soldiers are now slaughtering the deniers and doing more of that, and yeah, we go from there to chapter 14 where we see a lot more of how that civil war is already on its way, and it's cruel and it's brutal, and Steven Erikson doesn't spare us all the darkness. I mean, not that we've come to expect him doing, not sparing us grim details from reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but still, I felt it was handled in a different way. I guess one reason for that we might see here is that we don't have a clear, like, I don't want to say good, but with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, we always knew that the Malazans were kind of the good guys. They were obviously not always, not everyone and so forth, but when the Malazan army, the Malazan army, while being sometimes horrible, never like went too deep, at least not in the descriptions that we saw. I guess that's sort of the point. Not in the descriptions that we saw. Although, you go to like stuff that happens in Reaper's Gale, it seems like Hellion Squad is certainly going very like dark in some places, but only in some. So we have that whole idea, and we still have that idea like always explained as like you have a uniform and you need to hold to certain levels of honor and not fulfill. That famous speech of Dasim Ultors and so forth. So it was always clear that we had that organized army, the Malazans, and they are not really that. So when we encounter cruelty and atrocities in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, they are like, I guess, easier to stomach for a reader, because they were usually committed by someone who is clearly on the wrong side of it, right? They're clearly the bad guys, so to speak. It's Korbal O'Dom and his dog slayers, and while Korbal O'Dom obviously returns back to the Malazan fold in a specific way, he is a bad guy during that part, even though he may have had a lot of reasons for being that kind of person. I'm not saying that those, like when I use bad guys, I'm not saying they're like two-dimensional cookie cutters or anything, but it's usually happens on the sort of side that we as the readers are not on, and I feel sometimes that makes it easier to stomach atrocities, all kinds of atrocities. It's more difficult, I guess, when you look at later Malazan stuff, when you look at the Hobbling and Dust of Dreams and stuff like that. But even there, we get closer to that point where we see that war crimes, so to speak. Although the Hobbling obviously is not what you might call a war crime, it's something else. But, are committed by people whose kind of like motivations we sort of can guess at. Which makes it already more difficult. And I feel here with Corel Galen, it's with Forge of Darkness, it gets even more difficult because we see we have like, I don't know, it felt more raw and more direct, and especially when you look at the crew with I've already forgotten his name again, the one I spoke about yesterday, the dude who was part of Orphantal's escort and then got beaten, and now he hangs out with that part of Urisender's Legion, who is possibly, or is maybe following orders, or maybe not. And we get his perspective, like his inner thoughts and why he takes part in these atrocities, and how he kind of feels some kind of comradeship in the army there and so forth. And then they go and commit like horrible atrocities. They go and kill everyone in that wedding party, and rape the bride to be, and we get all of that perspective, and it's awful and it's horrible, and he knows that it's horrible, but he's also we see the point where he's like so, I don't know, so broken himself in his mind that that's, I guess, sort of the problematic part there that made it so difficult for me to read in a way that is. We also had that attack on the Orphantal's home, and I mean, so here's the thing that I found like interesting, that because I don't have the maps and I have like no idea how big Corel Galen actually is. So for a while, because I'm also not too good with like location names and everything, I wasn't aware that that monastery where Sigunda, the terrible tutor is hanging out, was brought to, is actually in the same village as the as the home of like the Corliss family, which weird. But I just wasn't aware of that, and that felt super close to where Draconis lives. But I guess it's still like more like a bit longer away. I don't know. As I said, geography is not my strong suit, and it's even less of a strong suit here when I can't even see the maps. So yeah, but that was like something that I just realized today. Um, I was like, let's have a look at more of that stuff, shall we? And one thing that I find interesting here is the idea of resentment, justified resentment, and reasons given in a way. Because what we find here is the argument in a way that what is like on its surface a religious war because they claim to defend Mother Dark by killing the deniers who worship that river god and everything, um, is in fact not a religious war, but is in fact a class war. It's a class war of these abandoned soldiers who want social standing on the same level as nobility, and they have reasons for that. We see that later, like in chapter 15, when we get like a lot of like Lady Hishtula, who's quickly becoming one of my favorite characters of this book so far. Um, but we'll go back to that later. Um, so there are justified reasons for a lot of these like decommissioned soldiers to feel a lot of resentment. And there is clearly what you always get in what you might call a feudalist society, which is obviously a feudalistic society there. There is a lot of people that have no power whatsoever, and once you train them to be soldiers because you need them in like self-defense or whatever, they suddenly have a specific kind of power. So decommissioning them is kind of difficult. And while this may have been also the case in real world medieval Europe, with like soldiers, it usually didn't work out that way. It feels more like the idea of, and this is, I guess, the problem though, is like more one of like recruiting a standing army as something new in a way. The Legion, maybe also the Host Legion, but they're like different. Because what you mostly had in medieval parts is not a standing army, but is more akin to what you might call the house blades. There, it's like you have people sworn to a specific lord and so forth, and employed by that specific lord and so forth. So it feels a bit more modern, in almost more modern, like early modern age, when you suddenly have large armies that can start and make demands on their own, and that leads to all kinds of problems. And then you just see like how I guess this is sort of where it gets interesting again. The idea that Arisander still is not fully aware of how his legion is behaving. At least it feels to me like that. I might be completely wrong. We'll see. Um, but it feels to me like he's not aware of how badly corrupted the army is, which comes back to that idea that you like we quickly like touched upon before with the Dasim Ultor's speech for the Malazan army, and Dasim Ultor obviously being a very honorable man, and Urisander seems to be an honorable man. Well, we'll see what comes of that. But Hanral certainly is not a honorable man. He has rather personal mean motives. And in fact, at this point, it is him who is in charge of the army. And so we see that idea that, in a way, the rot and the despicable things done by the army, by the reassembled legion, is very much a problem that may be connected to the moral destitute of its de facto leader right now. Which once again speaks very well to that discussion that Urisender had with Osiric when he says that like allegiance not inherit, it's like what was his word? It's earned in a way, because there is a lot of responsibility connected to that, and Hanral is certainly not up to that responsibility because he doesn't care for that. In a way. Now, there's obviously like theories about that we can spin on why that is, or may not be a good theory of military justice and military structure, but I'm not an expert on military things, so I don't know. Maybe we should ask the High Fist for that. An interesting, like, a side thing that I found fascinating was the or I'm still like interested in seeing where that whole thing will be going, is that quest of like Orphantal's father, that drunk maybe ex-soldier, um to go and find Sanderlath. I'm just wondering where that will be going, if that can actually work out into turn into some kind of redemption arc for him, or him like getting actually out of his like alcoholism for now. I'm still skeptical of that. And we'll see. Um Similarly, like that attack on, and I feel that's sort of where we come to the discipline thing, with like the leader of the army in this case also being an undisciplined kind of person, and we've like heard like mentions of that before when it was his like three cousins, three cousins on that trip out to the wardens and everything, and we had the perspective that they are also morally questionable, to put it mildly. So we see that there is some kind of yeah, moral rot or whatever you want to call it in the Legion at this point. And we see that like going down because there seem to be honorable characters still. Um, there's yeah, there seem to be those, and we see that in the attack on the like the house of Corless, and the rape and murder there and the burning down. And it was interesting to like, I like the way that we get like more of the perspective of that stable boy, and with all the awkward weird stuff that about that. Um, but we see that whole thing. How to say, was obviously done without the knowledge of the captain. When it's like, if they find out, they'll just hang us. But the discipline of that mob, of that army, so-called army, is highly like has completely broken down at this point. So yeah, there's that. Um, so what else can I say? I don't know. Um, I just felt that the whole like part was extremely well executed in chapter 14, the whole like attack and last stand of everyone there, including like that point where Kataspala finds like the situation and tears out his eyes. So he's very close to the person that will end up in a specific sword that has so far not yet been forged, but I suspect it may just happen in the next part. We'll see. Anyway, um, we see like once again that whole situation where like bad circumstances and like sometimes even correct decisions, or like logical decisions, lead to disaster. We see that with Krillin. Is that his name? Krill. Durav. Um, yeah, all of these parts. I don't know. I just that I was just like very much floored by the entire thing, like the entire scene at that place, how it turned out in the end, chapter 14, and then obviously the aftermath in chapter 15, and then obviously also that question of could it have been prevented by anyone. Obviously, Kadaspala knows whom he's gonna blame, but I suggest that Kadaspala was maybe even before not the soundest of mind. I don't know. Yeah, but still, that's sort of like what I felt with chapter 14. Now let's look at chapter 15 a bit more. And obviously now we have that confrontation with the sword and Mother Dog. And yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how much like her turning into a goddess or becoming a goddess and aspect to darkness means how much she's secluding herself from her own chosen people, like obviously Anamander, who seems not to be very happy with the whole thing. I mean, that's like one of the interesting aspects here is that now, even though we see more of Anamander Rake, we see obviously a bit more of Andarist and a bit more of Silchas Ruin. It's very interesting how difficult it actually like that. Even here, there's very little in like the way of making Anamander like become more understandable and human. And we even we even have the comments in there when we're talking about Kadaspala trying to figure out who Anamander is. So there's that. There's obviously also that like whole discussion with the priests and the Silan and the historian. There's a lot of commentary on like history and what history can do and what history can't do in there that I find, as someone who studied a bit of history myself, found very interesting. And there's all these like interesting details on the side with the draconic blood and chaos scene on the tapestry that Rise is talking with the high priestess, the remaining high priestess, about. And we once again see that idea that a like organized church or religion, whatever you want to call it, there, of the organization of that church, of that faith, being sort of like struggling with the fact that by nature, and this is, I guess, what becomes more and more a thing here with Mother Dark, is the idea that a deity, even in this kind of world, is far removed from the faithful, and that whole idea of ineffability. Did I say that right? Ineffability. Yeah, ineffability. You know what I mean. It's like they don't know what Mother Dark is thinking, and she ain't telling, so they're kind of forced to make up their own mind and make plans, which is exactly what the Catholic Church did for like the last 2,000 years, because God ain't talking that much. So there's that. And we see like the beginnings of that, and how like different, how it very much depends on the people in charge of like the organization, which is interesting because at this point in the story they could still totally just go to Mother Dark and ask. She just won't say anything, but you could still like physically actually go into that room and talk to her. So yeah, there's that. One thing that I really found interesting, and I know this is sort of like totally, probably not too relevant here, is that scene with Silchas Ruin and Scavandari, or Scarabandaris, who I suspect will become Scavandari Bloodeye. And I love that scene for like several reasons. So I suspect him to be Scavandari. I mean, that just makes sense. And they seem to be best buddies, or at least good friends, because Silchas seems to be like friends with like almost everybody. But I love that fact that like Silk just walks up to Skabandari's back and just grabs him, and Skabandari stiffens and is shocked. And then when you remember like the beginning of Midnight Tides, that was just like a fun like moment in a way. And the other thing is the Jellic hostages, which are obviously soul taken, as we know, and can turn into wolf, dog, whatever things. That scene where they discuss what to do with them and then decide to send them to Kagamandra, whatever his name Tulas is, whom I suspect to become Tulas Shorn. And we know from Toll the Hounds that Tulas Shorn was the one who tamed the Hounds of Shadow, or created the Hounds of Shadow more. And I suspect some connection coming up here, because apparently he's now in charge of will be in charge of the Jellic hostages. So I just love that idea. Like, maybe I'm wrong, it just feels like something that may come of it in the future. Now let's talk about Hishtula and her way down to Anomander Rake and all that, to Anomander and all that stuff. Which, you know, I found interesting, you know, that whole reflection on how the poor people are actually living in poverty, and the idea that the lower classes are more or less unseen by, you know, the people in power, the nobility and so forth, which is something that is really important to understand. The idea of like that specific classes, whether they are on like a geographic level where you have like people in specific countries when it comes to like post-colonial studies and stuff like that, are just not represented in the dialogue. When it comes to philosophy, for example, the question of like philosophy of war, when you see that like civilian victims of like wars, which you have a ton of, are usually, or for a long time at least, have been without a voice in any kind of dialogue, right? So you have, even when you start like having negotiations and whatnot, it's the the civilian population is usually not represented in those like arguments and dialogues for like rules of warfare and whatnot. And so that idea of large parts of a society being basically, in fact, without a voice, is something that is important. And it's good to see that Lady Hishtula understands that, or realize that at least, even though she obviously belongs to the nobility, to the higher classes. But yeah, seeing that, but we still see that idea when Grip talks to her, and we see that apparently Grip is has feelings for Lady Hishtula. There still is that kind of class difference between those two, even, which both sides are aware of, which is the big problem of like stratified societies. Like the those class differences are something that both sides are aware of. So there's that to look at. I also like want to point out again that I really appreciate the way we have like her inner monologues on questions of love and personality, and obviously also looks and stuff like that, and image. I guess image is more important here, reputation and image, and we see that going on with Hishtula all the time. I just feel like, I don't know, it feels very tender the way that Steven Erikson writes those things. Like he's very kind to his character, to the character of Hishtula in that case, compared to some other characters that don't, you know, where there's less kindness. Let's put it that way. But yeah, that's something that I really appreciated. And yeah, then we come to the scene of the crime and have the reactions of the three brothers, which I found very telling. I mean, first of all, there's Chris and Fall there, whom I really like. Also, he saved the dog, which is always cool, and it's Ribs, it's that dog, but which makes it even cooler, and makes it a dog that understands a lot of things because it obviously understood Rancid. Was that his name? And it understands Chris, but Chris Fowl is an Azathana, and whoever knows what those people can do or can't do. But still, that's interesting. And he is a very, very kind person, at least so far. So yeah. But what I found interesting is that scene when they come into the house and see the slaughter and see the terrible things that are done, and the way we see how the three brothers react, apart from Kataspalo trying to kill Anomander, and that whole idea that question of vengeance and grief, and the question of blame. I feel the question of blame is the really important thing here, because you see Anomander goes and judges and is very quick to say who he knows who to blame and who to wreak vengeance again, which is why he wants to name the sword Vengeance, which yeah. But we see that happening. He's very quick to judge, and we have Andarist, who wants to call it grief, and says that that first judgment may always judging and finding reasons why people do something is never enough, because you can always find another reason and another reason and go another reason back, which is interesting and important, because when we look at Steven Eriksson's writing, he is very good at creating characters, even terrible characters, exactly with those reasons that happened. But you always then have to wonder why were the people that traumatized those children that then turn into terrible adults, were their parents also tortured and traumatized as children, and so forth. So the idea of perpetuating that chain of violence and looking for blame, I feel, is a very interesting one and is a very important one. But then on the other hand, we have Silchas Ruin, who is once again caught between the two and tries to keep those two poles, where you might say that Anomander is the very, very rational person in that trio, the very much ruled by his intellect and his discipline and so forth, even though he kind of behaves irrational in this scene. But then you have Andarist, who is the more emotional type. He's the one who has love for everything and understanding and compassion, and we see Silchas as the kind of the bridge between the two the two brothers, in a way, which I found interesting. So I felt like that scene showed me more of all three brothers than I've had seen before at any point. And I appreciated it for that, even though obviously the tragedy of the entire scene is brutal. But then it ends with when everyone else abandons Andarist to do whatever they think is necessary, it's Hishtulda who goes and grieves with him and helps him there. Although we'll see where that goes, because obviously that last sentence of her embracing the last brother, the one that in their first meeting when she first looks at them, she realized that that last brother was now completely out of her reach after her being lovers, having the other two brothers as lovers at different times. So I don't know where that will go, but for now, I would say We've certainly got our red wedding from from Steven Erikson at this point. I I'm still slightly shocked at how brutal it felt compared to some of the absolutely brutal and horrible things that happen in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I just felt it keener this time round. I don't know. Maybe it's because this is my first time and I was rereading the Malazan Book of the Fallen for like the second time. So maybe that's just like the shock of reading it for the first time. But I also felt, because maybe the scale, even though the scale has obviously turned up, the actual scale of these happenings is still rather small compared to that whole global thing going on in Malazan. This is still just a rather small cast of characters and a rather small, intimate like scale of everything. So maybe that's why it felt harsher to me or more brutal to me. So yeah, I don't know what will go on in part four, but I'll certainly find out tomorrow. And until then, I'll leave you with the fall of darkness behind me, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Until then, cheers.